Hey, and welcome back to the final Toothpickings of the season. Thank you for being a part of it. Thank you for powering through and sticking around to the end. You won't be disappointed. This is going to be a very good interview. But I need to address the elephant in the room. You see it, I see it. It's the widow's peak. It's there. It is not genetic, I have to insist. It is an homage to the great Bela Lugosi. And if you can follow my segue here, Bela is the topic of today's web interview. Lynne Lugosi Sparks is the guest, and she is very good. She runs Lugosi Enterprises. I have to say, I've been chasing this interview for well over a year. We were supposed to do it face-to-face in May, and then along came COVID-19, and there goes the interview. But we managed to get it together on Skype, and Lynne has a lot of good stuff to say. A lot of information about her grandfather's biography, but also a lot of information about carrying on the legacy of Bela Lugosi to today. And speaking of his legacy, Bela's influence over the entertainment industry didn't end with his death. I mean, he was in a lot of movies, obviously, but the court case that came about after his death, brought by his son, Bela Lugosi Jr., Lugosi versus Universal, very important case, still taught in law schools, still comes up in a lot of law journals to this day. It was fought for well over a decade. You're going to hear about it today and the laws that were passed in the wake of that very important court case. Now, I just want to take a quick moment here in case you've watched this far and you're asking, who is Bela Lugosi? I don't know how we're still friends if you're asking that question, but if you've ever had a conception of Dracula in your head, you're probably having a conception of the icon created by Bela Lugosi. He was not the first actor to ever play Dracula on stage, but he did make that role famous on Broadway, and he was the first person to play Dracula on film on the Universal Pictures Dracula in the 1930s. That slicked back hair, the tuxedo, the cape, the Hungarian accent, that's all Bela Lugosi. And so if you see a caricature or a cartoon or a drawing of Dracula today, chances are what you are seeing is an interpretation based on Bela Lugosi. That's who we're talking about today. Finally, one cautionary note before this interview starts. This hurts me to say, but there was a technical error with the third-party software I use to record these interviews. Lynne's audio was recorded, but the video of her stopped after only 2 frames. Fortunately, it was a very good interview, and also fortunately, Bela Lugosi was very prolific, so there's a lot of photography and a lot of film footage of Bela that I was able to use to cover up those parts of the interview where nobody who was speaking was moving, which is the entire interview. So this is going to look a little different than the other web interviews, but I think it's a net gain. I think you're going to enjoy it. Stick around, enjoy this. I think you're going to like it. Lynne Lugosi Sparks, thank you so much for being on the webcast today.
Thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun.
I just want to be clear for anyone who isn't sure, you were not alive when your grandfather passed away, so you never knew him personally. Is that correct?
That's true. Yes. He was actually 56 when my father was born. So there's quite an age difference there. So unfortunately, no, I didn't ever get to meet him.
Well, you know, it's one thing to have a famous parent, but it's quite another to have a parent or a grandparent in your case who was an icon, whose just image is used and it communicates so much just through their own, just a caricature of their face.
Right.
At what point did you kind of realize that your grandfather's image was itself sort of this icon that people recognized, even if they didn't know his name?
Yeah. Well, I've told this story before, but really my earliest memory of realizing that he was somebody outside of just being my grandfather in pictures on our wall was in elementary school in the library book. I think it was, I'm not sure if it was Crestview, but I think it was, there were a series of Universal Monsters books. And there was one on Dracula that was filled with stills from the film. And I remember thinking, wow, I don't know if my mom and dad know that this is here. That it was kind of a revelation just at that elementary school age that he was something of a figure outside of our family.
Did you go rushing back and say, "Did you guys know Grandpa
Yeah, I'm
was
sure I checked
famous?"
the book out. Yeah, and I wish now I've seen them those books from time to time on eBay, and one of these days I'll find one because it is such a good memory for me. I would like to have that book.
Well, maybe someone watching today, some sharp-eyed viewer, will say, "Oh, the Chris Universal Monsters books." We'll send a link right away.
Great.
Well, how did all of that uh, get turned into what is today Lugosi Enterprises?
Well, really, that's attributed to my dad. We can talk a little bit more maybe about the court case that led to
Absolutely.
the ability to license his name and likeness. But I, after the Celebrity Rights Act was enacted here in California, my dad formed Lugosi Enterprises, I believe in 1982, and so up until that point, he just kind of managed the use of his dad's name and likeness on a case by case, basis when it came to his attention, but really started realizing that there was a need to protect the name and likeness, and also that fans wanted stuff, and so really that's when the licensing business started, and I came on board in the about 2010, and my boys had graduated from high school, and I had time to put my full efforts into the business.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that case. Younger people might not know about the Lugosi versus Universal case, which at the time was a really big deal. Your father, Bela Lugosi Jr., brought a court case against Universal Pictures, called Lugosi versus Universal. What was the meat of that case?
It was in 1963, and he was actually still in law school at the time.
Oh, I
And it
didn't
was
know that
brought,
much.
yeah, it was brought to his attention, I believe, by one of his professors that Universal was producing merchandise, models and lunch boxes with, my grandfather's name and likeness on it. And the professor said, you can't, that's not right, So he did bring the case against Universal. He won in the lower courts, and then it was in the courts for 16 years. It was eventually turned over by the California Supreme Court, but only for the reason that there was no precedent set for the name and likeness of a deceased celebrity to become a property right. So in California at that time, the Supreme Court of California agreed with the lower court that Bela Lugosi owned his interpretation of Dracula and his likeness as Dracula, but there was no precedent for that right to be passed down to the heirs. So really, even though after 16 years in the court, it was a loss at the Supreme Court level, it really enabled California legislation to be enacted, basically overturning that Supreme Court decision and making the rights a property right that could pass to your heirs.
So, this is the question I had, and I wasn't totally sure with the California Celebrity Rights Act, which was passed shortly after, really was a response to that court case.
Yes,
It
yes.
was. Okay, I thought maybe it was, but I wasn't sure.
Yes, my dad, along with a number of other families who were interested in getting legislation passed to make sure that they could protect the name and likeness of their heirs, really is what prompted that legislation. I think in 1984 it was enacted.
You know, Bela Lugosi Sr. was really active in the early days of performers' unions, actors' unions,
Yeah.
protecting the rights of performers. Did your dad ever say that he felt like he was in some way following in his father's footsteps in protecting the rights of performers, even if it was in passing down value to a performer's heirs?
Right. I don't think that I've ever heard him mention that exactly, but I do know that he was always very proud of his dad for supporting actors' rights. His Bela Lugosi began in forming trade unions in Hungary
Hmm.
and carried that passion to really stand up for actors here in the US. And when the Screen Actors Guild was in its very early stages, my grandmother has told stories of driving him to meetings that were secret in people's garages because these actors didn't want the academy or the studios to get wind that they were forming this union. And so he was in on the ground floor of that, and I think maybe a little bit hesitant to put his name on it at the very, very beginning, just because of the repercussions he felt from his organization of the trade unions in Hungary. But he did end up becoming an official member number 28 in July of 1933. So I think with knowing that how important that was and what a big part of my grandfather's Hollywood career that was, I'm sure that that affected my dad in wanting to protect what my grandfather worked so hard to do.
If I'm remembering the biographies of your grandfather correctly, part of the reason he left Hungary was because of fear, because a lot of the early union members had to get the heck out of there because
Right.
of the governments that were coming in that were very right wing and very anti-union.
Yes.
Um, and
Yeah.
so it's admirable that he was brave enough after coming to the U.S. that he was willing to try it again.
Right. Right. It's true. He's very brave.
And I saw some. This is kind of an aside, but there's a lot of kind of modern day mythologizing of a rivalry between your grandfather and Boris Karloff. But a lot of that is laid to rest because I have seen all these film footages of Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff working together, joking together
Yeah.
in the context of early days of the Screen Actors Guild because they worked together to try to get that off the ground.
True.
They were both early members, and I don't know who influenced who more in that regard, but they
Right.
were both lent their name and celebrity to that at the time.
Yes, that's true. And I have my dad has no memory of his dad ever having any ill feelings, about Boris Karloff, and we are good friends with Sarah Karloff, and she has said too that their relationship was very professional and they had very different lives, so they didn't really interact socially, but
Sure.
on the set they were very professional. Of course, they were competing for a lot of the same roles during that early days, so I'm sure there was some competition on that front. But as individuals, they were very cordial to each other.
It seems like it might just be one of those stories that people can't resist. Like, oh,
Oh,
there had to be a rivalry. There had to
right,
be some
right,
sort of bad blood between them because they
right,
both played monsters, and
right.
yeah. But
True.
I think the truth is probably better than the fiction that they actually got along quite well.
Yeah.
It is an historic occasion whenever Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi confront each other. Their very presence weaves a spell of mystery and horror.
Ready for the test, Dracula? I'm ready, Frankenstein. Then let us begin. You understand, Bela, don't you? That the one who wins this little game of chess is to lead the parade at the film stars' frolic. Okay, Boris. You'll move. Right.
Growing up with a name like Lugosi, did that become a help or a hindrance to you?
I think it always brought good attention. There were adults, maybe when I was a child, that would say, it would notice the name right off and
Sure.
throw out a line from the movie or that. And I was always slightly shy and embarrassed, but always everything was always with admiration. But definitely the name gets noticed, and like my dad being Bela Lugosi Jr., he has said almost every day of his life, somebody comments on his name.
I'm sure he had it far worse. Well, actually, that ties into a question I got from the internet. Azzy on Amino wanted to know if you ever wanted to just be known as Lynne and not have that shadow of Lugosi behind you.
Well, I've never considered it a shadow in a bad way. It's always been something that I'm very proud of. So it's never been a hindrance. And my married name is Sparks, so I have kept Lugosi, but for a lot of my interactions, some people might not even know my full name is Lynne Lugosi Sparks.
Because your grandfather's last name wasn't even Lugosi; it was Blasco. Am I saying that right? Blasco?
I believe so. I don't have a good Hungarian accent either, but I think Blasco.
How did he change that name, or why did he pick the name Lugosi over Blasco?
So he was born in the town of Lugos, which at the time was in Hungary, but is now in Romania. And coincidentally, not too far from Transylvania and the Carpathian Mountains where Bram Stoker's novel is set.
Isn't that interesting how that all worked out?
Yes.
Hey, how you doing? We're about a quarter of the way through the interview, and I wanted to have a little check-in. How are you doing? How do you think this whole thing is progressing? Are you happy with it? I gotta be honest, I was really crestfallen when the technical errors made themselves known, but Lynne gave such a good interview, and thank goodness the audio is there, and Bela Lugosi's career was so prolific that I think there's enough material to kind of make this thing still work. I'm feeling pretty good about it. I think we should soldier on and finish this entire web interview. Are you with me? All right, let's do it. Actually, the real reason I broke in on this was, besides wanting to introduce you here to Edit Suite V, where I cut the webcasts and make bad photoshops for my blogs, as I was finding photography and whatnot to place over this interview, I came across a tidbit that I thought you might be interested in if you appreciate Bela Lugosi biographies, and who doesn't? That's why we're here, right? He became an American citizen in 1931, a few months after Dracula was released. And in order to become an American citizen, he had to renounce his old citizenship. Now, you heard Lynne say he was born in Lugos, Hungary, but where was Lugos located in 1931? The town hadn't moved, but the borders around it were a little more questionable, a little more fluid. Bela didn't know if Lugos was at that moment part of Hungary or part of Romania. And the immigration office didn't know either. They got out maps, they made a few phone calls, they tried to figure it out, and no one was really sure. So what Bela ended up doing was, in order to become an American citizen, he renounced his citizenship in 2 countries, one of which he was definitely not a citizen of. But he covered his bases pretty well. Anyway, I find it fascinating that Lugos is now part of Romania, close to Transylvania, the part of the world where Bela is most famous for having played a character from, even though he is originally born in Hungary. If you don't find that interesting, I'm sorry, you should have fast-forwarded to this whole part. You know, there is a bit on YouTube where you can play these things at double speed. You're welcome. And let's get back to hearing Lynne discuss her fascinating grandfather, Bela Lugosi.
He grew up with the folklore from that area where the tales of vampires and werewolves were very real, to the people in that area. So it's when he went to play that role, he had an entire lifetime growing up with those familiar stories and could definitely portray the fear of a vampire coming to life could really cause.
And how interesting that if he was so familiar with the folk tales of vampires, that he would know that the folk vampire would be so much different than the Dracula vampire.
Right. Right.
But he was talented enough to realize that, oh, I have to play the fear as the folk tales would know it, but I have to play the character the way the stage and the film demand it.
Right. And I think even though, somebody else had played that role on stage in England before, what Bela Lugosi did and why his portrayal has become so iconic is he took this monster, this story of the vampire, this creature, and he made it this seductive, romantic character.
Sure.
So it was, even more terrifying, especially to audiences at that time, that this monster could be hidden inside somebody so enticing,
Right, to audiences that were used to their monsters being repulsive,
Right.
to suddenly be confronted with the idea that the monster could be magnetic,
Right.
they had to look within themselves and realize that I could be attracted to the most worst kind of evil, and what does that say about me? And suddenly that's a whole new kind of terror.
Right.
And Bela brought that out of people.
It's true. I mean, still today, how in vampire movies, it's very sensual. The portrayals typically are of vampires, or at least they have that element. And I think that is because people can identify it with it. It's more like you say, there's that human aspect to it that you might not get in some of the other classic monsters, that makes you think exactly that. Like, especially for women, what am I attracted to that?
Right.
Yeah, I think I am.
Sometimes, as a shorthand, I'll say, "Well, which vampire do you mean? Do you mean the Bela Lugosi vampire, or do you mean the Max Schreck vampire?" They're both vampires. One is a little closer to the folklore. One is a little closer to the literature.
Right.
They're both valid. One sells a little bit better.
Yeah.
I find this one a little more horrific.
Yes.
This one's a little more fun.
Right. I've always
which one
thought,
do you prefer?
though, one of the things that makes Bela Lugosi's portrayal so good and so iconic are his hands. And when you see, I mean, Max Schreck, Nosferatu had those hands that were obviously, extensions or anything else. But Bela's were his own hands, and I thought he could really contort them.
He did that thing with them. Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, in Ed Wood, I believe they do a whole demonstration where he's recreating that
look. Yeah.
I wonder. Go ahead.
When you're talking about vampires and Nosferatu versus Bela Lugosi as Dracula, we have people send us images all the time, or come up to us in person when we're doing a convention or an appearance, and show us their tattoos. And most of them, if they have Bela Lugosi, they'll have Nosferatu, somewhere else. But the tattoo art that we have seen is so amazing, and it's just another way that I am so honored that people want to wear Bela Lugosi on them. They want to keep him close to them because his work, or what he represents, or the role he represents, is so important to them, and the artwork is really amazing.
Now, do you sign that off when you see the tattoo and you say, "Okay, this is approved by Lugosi Enterprises"?
No, all that's original art.
Perfect. But that is really cool, though, that even in the tattoos they'll have the two sides of the same vampire coin, if you will.
Right, or they'll have one part of their body that's dedicated to Dracula, and different people's interpretation of that, and Frankenstein, of course, and Wolfman, the Mummy.
That would be quite the ink to see. I would love to see someone who's just head to toe Universal monsters.
Oh, we've seen it.
Excellent. And I see you have a cape behind you. Is that from a film set, or is that a recreation?
So this is behind me is actually a replica of Bela Lugosi's personally owned screen-worn cape that was recently donated by my father and the Lugosi family to the Academy Museum.
This dovetails with a question that I got from the internet, and Hex Maniac from Amino wanted to know if your grandfather got to keep anything from his film sets.
Right.
And there's a legend that your grandfather was buried with his Dracula cape.
Right.
Is there anything to that?
So he was buried in one of his Dracula capes. That is true. He had several. The one that was worn in the 1931 film, he continued to wear in appearances and on stage and doing the stage play for his whole life. And he had a lighter weight one for some of the summer stock plays that he did where it was very hot. So he would alternate between those. But, the one that was near and dear to his heart was the screen worn one. And my grandmother really kept that in top shape for him while they traveled around and kept it even after he passed. But he was buried in another cape that he owned.
Your fate is to be what you are, as mine is to be what I am.
Besides playing Dracula and other vampires, or other people playing vampires, or other creepy characters who we were supposed to think were a vampire in some other way. I've seen him in several films where you are led to believe he is a vampire, only to be revealed in the final act that he was never a vampire. But he was cast to be that character because he's Bela Lugosi, and the director wanted you to think that he was the vampire the whole time.
Sure. I mean, his performance was so mesmerizing in Dracula that people, of course, wanted to trade on that, the name and the look, to draw attention to other films.
This vampire business, it has given me a great idea for a new act. Luna, in this new act, I will be the vampire. Did you watch me? I gave all of me. I was greater than any real vampire.
Sure. But get off your makeup.
Yes, and help me with some of this packing.
So, he only played Count Dracula in the 1931 Universal film and Abbott and Costello Meets Frankenstein.
How many times have I heard the English 1931 Dracula compared to the Spanish 1931 Dracula? And quite often, the English version gets compared unfavorably to the Spanish version in terms of the cinematography.
Right.
But everyone says, but the Spanish version just doesn't have Bela Lugosi.
Right. And I think that's because, the Spanish version was filmed on the same set with most of the same costumes at night. So they got to watch the filming from earlier that day and could then say, we can do this better. This would be more effective if we do this. So they did have that advantage. And I think that's, probably why one of the reasons that the film might have been.
Always great to learn from someone else's mistakes, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Well, tell me about some of the other things I see behind you there. Are some of those Lugosi Enterprises paraphernalia?
Yeah. Well, there's a bronze statue. Can you see that behind me? Do you want me to bring them a little closer to the screen?
Sure. Let's take a look.
But that is a beautiful bronze sculpture by an artist named Henry Alvarez. The action figures from Sideshow are still highly collectible. This is one of the more recent figures by Migo.
Love it.
Yep. And of course, there's the pop. You got to have some Bela's Brew coffee.
And is that a Bela Lugosi's red I see back there?
That's actually beer.
Oh, it's beer. Okay.
Yeah, we have Bela Lugosi Malbec. Unfortunately, this is sold out, but one of the things that Lugosi LLC and Lugosi Enterprises is doing is continuing to produce wine. And
now, how often do you have to deal with someone who says, "But wait a minute, I don't drink wine"?
Right.
Aren't Aren't you drinking?
I never drink. Why?
Actually, Bela Lugosi in real life did drink wine. He actually enjoyed it very much, and he and my grandmother would have their own wine tasting. So the wine has always been a tribute to my grandfather, for just as a person, the man he was. You know, he enjoyed good food and good wine and good cigars.
Okay, Lynn, you might have to bust me here. Dracula action figure.
Yes.
Is this licensed, or did I buy something off-brand and I have now committed a horrible sort of Lugosi Enterprise thought crime?
No, that one is licensed. I think that one is, maybe that one was the reaction figure that Funko made?
Yes, this is a reaction figure. Yes.
Yeah, I think Funko made one, and also Super 7 is making some different versions of that same figure.
Excellent. He usually lives in that little coffin up there, or during Christmas when I have my manger scene, I like to hang him upside down in the barn, just behind the baby Jesus.
That's a new one.
Although I know Dracula in the movie never did the upside down thing, but it feels on brand.
Right. That's funny.
Bela Lugosi's dead.
I have another question from the internet. Verbal Venom from Amino wanted to ask, and I was hesitant to ask this question, but now that I see the backdrop, I do feel I need to ask, are you a fan of the Bauhaus song, Bela Lugosi's Dead?
Well, of course. I mean, that song has immortalized him really with, you know, every generation since it came out. You know, when people hear that song, they hear Bela Lugosi's name over and over again, and it just helps us continue on the legacy.
Undead, 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 the virginal brides file past his tomb, strewn with time's dead flowers, bereft in deathly bloom, alone in a darkened room, the Count. Bela Lugosi's dead. Bela Lugosi's dead. Bela Lugosi's dead. Undead, undead, undead.
You know, we were fortunate to see Peter Murphy in Los Angeles perform it live a few years back, and it was really a treat. But yes, you know, I'm not an avid follower of the band on a routine basis, but that song is as iconic, I think, as Bela Lugosi is.
And that song just turned 40,
right?
I think within the past year.
Yes.
So maybe it just turned 41.
Right.
And is that the record that I see behind you?
Yeah, that's the glow-in-the-dark version of the record.
Excellent. You know, and the thing about that album is that I think that it may have been the first time I heard the name, was hearing that song, and I'm guessing that's true for a lot of people.
Exactly.
Especially people, you know, as they are growing up, they start to hear alternative music for the first time. They get introduced to punk or goth for the first time, and they hear Bela Lugosi's Dead. And of course, they hear that refrain over and over again, and they start to wonder, who is
exactly.
Bela Lugosi?
Yeah. Yeah,
and of course, it leads us to all mispronounce Bela Lugosi's name as Bela Lugosi.
True.
Which I've done several times in this interview. I apologize, but it's because of that song. I blame Peter Murphy.
That's right. He perpetuated it. But no, and you know, I hear all the time new bands, you know, re-releasing their version of Bela Lugosi's Dead, because it's just one of those songs that is crying out to be remade.
It's the goth Freebird, someone said to me one time, because
That's true.
It's so long.
That's true. I know. I have several versions, you know, on my playlist, and you know, when that long one comes on, wow.
Well, we need a punk rock version that is sped up so that we can, get on to some other things we need to do with our day.
Right.
We mentioned the Karloff family earlier. Are you in contact with some of the other families of the other Universal monsters, the Cheneys, the other Karloffs, anyone like that?
Yes, we are friends with both Sarah Karloff and the Cheney family, and about once a year have an opportunity to all get together at the Monster Palooza convention here in the Los Angeles area. And it's always a lot of fun for us to be all together and for fans too, to have kind of the classic monster row there. And so we have a lot of fun together.
Are there things you're doing besides just licensing and merchandise?
Yes, I mean, really licensing, it's growing. The Bela Lugosi brand is actually an official brand now. And so that part of the business is growing, but really it's secondary to our mission to extend his name and likeness and to protect his name and likeness from, those who might want to misuse it or use it in a way that we don't feel is appropriate. And so our mission really at its heart is to keep his legacy alive. And we do that with projects that aren't merchandise. We have been collecting his films, on either 16 millimeter or 35 millimeter, and we've donated those to the Academy Film Archive under the Bela Lugosi collection. So that's a project that we will continue to do as long as we can find those films. So anybody out there, if you know of any film elements that are real great quality, we're interested. We want to protect those because really at the heart of keeping his memory alive is his work. We don't want those film elements to disappear. Of course, we have donated the cape to the Academy Movie Museum, the Film Museum, but we're really proud of that. I mean, it's a beautiful museum. The cape does the world no good sitting in a closet where nobody can see it or in the hands of a collector who doesn't display it. So we are so proud of that. And it's really kind of the holy grail of horror costumes. And the museum is thrilled to have it. And we're thrilled that it's there.
It's a good point. And in these days of COVID, we could all take a note from holding a cape over our mouth like this.
There you go. You can get the costume cape. People who try it on just like to walk around with it. It's really cozy.
I bet it feels like it feels good. It feels comforting. It feels secure.
Yeah, it does.
Too constrictive. I can't even fold my arms.
Gee, Mr. Lugosi, I've never had any complaints.
This is the most uncomfortable coffin I've ever been in.
Let me ask you about one specific movie that does not have Bela Lugosi in it, and that's the movie Ed Wood that came out in 1994. Personally, it was my first introduction to who this human being was because I was 19 or 20 when it came out. I did not know who Bela Lugosi really was at that time. Yeah. And I suspect that a lot of people in my generation did not either. I wonder, was Ed Wood kind of a film that triggered interest in your grandfather for Generation X and below? Or was it just another in a series of Bela Lugosi adjacent materials?
No, I definitely think it triggered a new interest with, a whole new generation of fans, especially because Martin Landau won the Academy Award for his portrayal of Bela Lugosi. But, so there's all the good points about that and how it has helped, the family keep his legacy alive with the new generation of fans. But people want to think that Ed Wood was the absolute factual true story of Bela Lugosi. And they took some liberties with, how they characterized him, really as a man. And that's disappointing because, while it might have been better movie watching, it wasn't really true to who he was. And also, of course, focusing on that very short time period of his life at the end of it, a very long, successful career. People don't get a grip of the whole person, this whole, body of work.
Play up the tragedy in order to tell a better story.
Yeah, and things like, my father doesn't ever remember him using bad language like he did in the film.
You were great as Karloff's sidekick.
Karloff? Sidekick? Fuck you! Karloff does not deserve to smell my shit! That limey cocksucker can rot in hell for all I care!
What happened?
How dare that asshole bring up Karloff? You think it takes talent to play Frankenstein? It's all makeup and grunting.
Bela, I agree 100%. Now, Dracula, that's a role that requires talent.
Of course! Dracula requires presence. It's all in the eyes and the voice and the head.
That's right. That's right. You seem a little agitated. You want to go outside and get some air?
Bullshit! I'm ready now. Roll the camera.
The cursing scene, I've heard several people criticize the scene where he curses about Boris Karloff, because they've said he may have gotten gruff at some point, but Bela Lugosi was always very gentlemanly, and he never would have started cursing like that. And anyway, that is a criticism I've heard leveled from several corners.
Yeah. So the positive is that it did open up, like for you, that question, who is Bela Lugosi? What was he all about? So in that way, yes, that was a success. But in telling the true story, we hope to one day do our own project. Been in talks. We get scripts all the time for films, but we are in the early stages of developing a documentary.
So if you're making the new life story of Bela Lugosi, dramatic, who plays Bela Lugosi if you can't get Martin Landau now?
No, good question. I don't know. I think there would be a casting call, and to me it'd be somebody maybe new. We haven't seen before.
Well, I'm no actor and I don't have a Hungarian accent, but I've got the widow's peak if you just need a stand-in.
Yeah, it's good.
I'd stand in for the lighting, then you can have the real actor come in, but you can model the widow's peak just right. Although people forget he didn't have the widow's peak when he played Dracula. That was only later on that he had the famous look.
Well, I don't think my grandfather would ever imagine that I look at his face all day long, every day in what I do. So I start, especially putting the pictures together for the biography, you start looking at side-by-side pictures of the same film or that. But anyway, in Dracula, he didn't want anybody to do, he did his own makeup. Jack Pierce, I believe, went to Max Factor and had a special base makeup made for him that had a little bit of a green tinge that would show up very pale on the black and white film. But he did his own makeup, but he did wear a hairpiece to form that widow's peak in Dracula.
And oddly, and that's the thing that gets remembered is the more pronounced widow's peak.
Right, and the fact that he never had fangs.
Right. That's the other thing.
We're doing, merchandise, or people want to, do a new work of Bela Lugosi. It's always that question: do we add fangs or not? We typically don't do it because he didn't wear them, and that also added some of the kind of intrigue to him playing a vampire and not seeing the teeth.
Now, I understand you have a graphic novel coming out as well.
Yes, with Legendary Comics. It's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Okay.
Graphic novel with Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula. And so It's a very good mashup, if you will, of, I think, what all fans of Bela Lugosi and of the novel have always been curious to see, and that's what would Bram Stoker's novel look like with Bela Lugosi playing the lead. And so it's very interesting. And this is one instance where you'll see Bela Lugosi with fangs and a little more vicious than you've ever seen him before.
Let me put you on the spot. Do you know who the illustrator is on that?
Yes, L. Gehrig.
Okay.
Along with Carrie Gamble.
Excellent.
Yes.
Does it follow the? Let me bring it out here. Does it follow the novelized Bram Stoker, or does it follow the more stage version that is closer to the film?
No, it follows the actual novel.
All right.
The original novel.
So for people in the know, if you know Bela Lugosi from the film, you're watching the stage version. But
Correct.
Now we'll see Bela Lugosi in the novel version.
Correct.
Which is quite a bit different in a lot of places.
It is. I believe if you visit Legendary Comics, online, they have some more information about it.
Okay, we'll have to look out for that. I can't wait to see that. Well, Lynne, I think that's a great place to leave this. Thank you so much for being a part of this interview. I've wanted to sit down and chat with you for a while now about everything involving Lugosi Enterprises, about Lugosi versus Universal, and all the projects you're working on right now. So thanks for taking the time to catch me up on all these things.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it, and I appreciate your interest.
Absolutely. Take care, and please stay safe. We'll get through all this together, and I can't wait to see the new books and the graphic novel when it all comes out.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again to Lynne Lugosi. That was a wonderful interview. Sorry for the technical problems, but it all kind of worked out. We had a lot more visual interest than we usually do in these interviews, where it's usually just me and the interviewee. So there's a lot more to look at. So all's well that ends well. Hopefully, like this current COVID crisis we're going through. If you're watching this in the future, I hope our ways seem very quaint. I hope these interviews still hold up and still provide some timely information to you. But I also hope that you look at all this worry we had about the coronavirus and say, yeah, that must have sucked. Glad we don't have to deal with that now. I hope that is your reaction, future people. Teach me your ways. I'm going to put some links down below to Lugosi Enterprises. You can see some of the things Lynne is working on, the Lugosi wine, as well as some information on Lugosi versus Universal. There's a lot of information out there about it. I'm just going to put one or two links to give you a general idea if you want to read some more about it. And you know what? Why not? Bela has quite a few movies out there. Maybe there's a few that I can find on YouTube, and I'll throw some links down below for those as well. Some of them are going to be free. Some of them are not. And it's one of those get what you pay for sort of things. If you want to watch Dracula, that's not going to be a freebie on YouTube. White Zombie, that one I think might be free. Don't quote me on that until I actually getting the link down below, but we'll see. On a personal note, I want to say that doing these interviews has been really good for the soul. I want to thank all the interviewees who've been a part of it across the whole season, and I want to thank you for being a part of it as well. Your comments have meant a lot to me. Really, it's kept me going and kept me doing these things, because after the first couple, I was like, what's the point? And then people started to say things, and I was like, oh, there really is an audience for this. Let's keep going. Let's see how far we can go with this. But right now, I have no more interviews scheduled. Nobody else is lined up. I'm not going to be one of those never say never people, because who knows what will come along. Maybe there'll be a 4th season of Toothpickings later on. But for right now, I've got some other projects I have to work on. One of them does involve vampires, and I don't want to talk it up too much, because if it doesn't pan out, I'm going to sweep it under the rug and we shall never speak of it again. But you know what? If it goes somewhere, if it has some legs, you will be hearing about it. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I don't have a clever sign-off, except that we are still living in a pandemic as I record this right now. So please take the precautions. Wash your hands longer than you are right now. Keep further away from people than you are right now. And cover your mouth more than you are now. I don't care what your crazy aunt is telling you. Just cover up, all right? Okay, we're good. You're good. Let's all be here again in a year, okay? Thanks a lot.